After 35 years, Keith Whitley's family have finally revealed what really happened to him.
Without saying a word.
I've been working almost too much. It's hard to find that happy medium, where you can be home and still work enough to pay the bills. But
It was early May of 1989 when Keith Whitley volunteered to take his wife and fellow performer, Lorrie Morgan, to the Nashville airport to see her off on a promotional trip she was taking to Alaska. In a week, Lorrie would be releasing her debut album on RCA Records called Leave the Light On. Though it was her debut release, Lorrie Morgan was already well known and revered in country music, and had been a member of the Grand Ole Opry for half a decade when Lorrie Morgan was inducted into the Grand Ole Opry in 1984. She became the institution's youngest ever invited member. Keith Whitley and Lorrie Morgan had been married for 3 years at that point, and they were one of country music's emerging power couples. In a couple of weeks, Keith Whitley was scheduled to be asked to join the Grand Ole Opry himself, and was riding high off his third consecutive #1 single, I'm No Stranger to the Rain, which had topped the Billboard country charts 3 weeks prior. Before Lorrie Morgan left on her flight, Keith Whitley gave her a greeting card with a note in it. Little did Lorrie Morgan know how much the note would mean to her, and how poignant it would be when she opened it a week later. This is the story of the death of country music star Keith Whitley. After Keith Whitley saw Lorrie Morgan off at the Nashville airport on that late spring day in 1989, he began a weekend of heavy drinking. The sobriety had only lasted about 6 months before he fell back off the wagon once again, which couldn't have been a surprise to anyone. Whitley had been battling alcoholism since he was a teenager. He was also used to flirting with danger during his teenage years. Whitley and his friends would sip on bottles of bootleg bourbon and drive down the winding mountain roads of Kentucky at unsafe speeds. Once, when riding passenger in a car and passing a bottle back and forth with the driver, they tried to take a sharp curve at 120 miles per hour. The driver died, and Whitley almost broke his neck. It would be one of many close calls for Whitley, including driving his own car off a 120-foot cliff and into a frozen river, walking away that time with a broken collarbone. Lucky to be alive, the whole family had a reckless streak. Keith's brother Randy died in a motorcycle accident in 1983. Keith Whitley told the Chicago Tribune once, "I learned to do things the way the old-timers did. I thought everybody had to drink to be in this business. Lefty drank, Hank drank, George was still drinking, and I had to. That's just the way it was. You couldn't put that soul in your singing if you weren't about 3 sheets in the wind." End quote. Born in Ashland, Kentucky, and raised in the small town of Sandy Hook, Keith Whitley received his start in country music during high school as a member of Ralph Stanley's bluegrass band, the Clinch Mountain Boys, right beside longtime friend Ricky Skaggs. Stanley discovered the boys when he blew a tire in Fort Gay, West Virginia, and happened to walk into the club where they were playing. The bluegrass legend was blown away when he heard the music playing from outside. Ralph Stanley thought it was a jukebox playing an old Stanley Brothers record. Nope, it was Skaggs and Whitley. With the way Whitley was influenced by Carter Stanley in his singing style, it really helped to sell the two young, scrappy musicians as the real deal. Keith Whitley was just 15 years old at the time, and Ricky Skaggs was 16. Ralph Stanley recruited both of them for his band right then and there. Now, Ralph Stanley had a rule that he wouldn't drink with any of the other members of the band, but he would drink with Keith Whitley. Stanley would say to him, quote, "You can handle it. I'm afraid to give it to the rest of these boys," unquote. Though hired as a guitarist, it was Whitley's singing that really made him stand out, and soon he was the lead vocalist for the Clinch Mountain Boys. After cutting his teeth with Ralph Stanley, Keith Whitley would later join J.D. Crowe and his band, the New South, right about the time his boyhood friend Ricky Skaggs left J.D. to form a band with dobro player Jerry Douglas. Whitley replaced pioneering flat-pick guitarist Tony Rice in the New South and ended up pushing the band in a more country and electric direction. Keith carried his love for drink and his close calls with self-destruction with him to the new endeavor. But just about the time everything would begin to unravel for Keith Whitley due to his drinking, he would hold it together just enough to pull through. Whitley released 3 successful albums with J.D. Crowe before moving to Nashville in 1983, where he would soon sign a record deal with RCA, in part due to the attention he'd earned in the New South and the success Music Row was having with fellow Kentuckian Ricky Skaggs as an emerging solo artist. Keith Whitley's first major record was a 1984 EP called A Hard Act to Follow, and it didn't fare too well. Released right before the neo-traditional movement that would sweep country music in earnest on the backs of guys like Randy Travis and George Strait, A Hard Act to Follow was deemed too country. Two countries, Whitley remarked at the time, "What business am I in?" But the 1985 album LA to Miami, which took a bit more of a pragmatic approach, put Whitley on the map with songs like Miami, 10 Feet Away, and Hard Living, though the production of Miami, Miami was much more contemporary, and the lyrics written by Hank Cochran and Dean Dillon were a little bit forced. It was the voice of Keith Whitley soaring from the song that spoke to many, and it soon became one of his signature tunes. Then Keith's 1988 record, Don't Close Your Eyes, set him on the path to downright superstardom, landing him his first #1 hit with the title track, which would set off a succession of 5 straight #1 songs from Whitley. The hope was finding success would finally help to settle Keith Whitley down, at least to some extent, as would hopefully his marriage to Lorrie Morgan in 1986. The couple had a baby in June of 1987 named Jesse Keith Whitley, and Whitley also officially adopted Lorrie's daughter from her first marriage. But with Lorrie Morgan out of town that first weekend of May 1989, there was nobody there to look after Whitley or rein in his raging alcoholism. Lorrie Morgan knew the risk of entering a romantic relationship with Whitley. One of Keith's managers, Don Light, had warned her early on after the two country entertainers had met at the Grand Ole Opry, but Whitley had always treated Lorrie Morgan well. She insists to this day that Keith never said a negative word to her or raised his voice at her during the entirety of their marriage. It was himself that Keith Whitley would regularly put in harm's way. Lorrie Morgan recalls, quote, "It was like a ticking time bomb. I knew all this going into the relationship. I thought as much as I loved Keith, surely that would help him. I feel in my own heart, I kept Keith alive a lot longer because I was there at the time. I put everything on the back burner, including my career, to help Keith. Every time the phone would ring, it was in the back of my mind that there was somebody calling to tell me he's been in a wreck or died of alcohol. It was a living hell. I was on pins and needles when he was on the road," unquote. Lorrie Morgan was very much a daughter of country music, who would end up blossoming into a wife and a mother of the genre as well. Her father was Country Music Hall of Famer and Grand Ole Opry member George Morgan, one of country music's classic crooners, similar in style to Eddie Arnold and Jim Reeves. Lorrie Morgan is a rare Nashville, Tennessee native in country who grew up around the music and in the wings of the Grand Ole Opry, making her first appearance on the show at the age of 13, singing the song Paper Roses and receiving a standing ovation. Morgan's close affiliation with the Opry is how she became a member before she became a proper recording artist. Lorrie did record a succession of singles in 1979, including one as a posthumous duet with her father, and she recorded a couple of more singles in 1984 too, but nothing that fared well commercially. She was mostly a live performer early on, appearing on the Opry and performing on tour, opening for the likes of the Oak Ridge Boys and Jack Green, and singing backup for George Jones. It wasn't until signing with RCA Records in 1988 that Lorrie's recording career would commence in earnest, and right about the time she would be asked to endure arguably the greatest trial of her life. On the morning of Tuesday, May 9, 1989, Keith Whitley spoke to his mother briefly on the phone and then was visited by his brother-in-law, Lane Palmer, at his home in Goodlettsville, Tennessee, near Nashville. The two drank coffee together and were planning to play a round of golf and have lunch that day. After that, Whitley was planning to write some songs to present to Lorrie Morgan after she returned from her promotional tour in Alaska, for perhaps the two to record together as duets. Brother-in-law Lane Palmer left Whitley's Goodlettsville residence at approximately 8:30 a.m., planning to return an hour later for the golf excursion. But when Palmer returned at about 11:30 a.m., he found Whitley fully clothed on his bed, unconscious and unresponsive. He called an ambulance, which took Whitley to a local hospital, where Keith Whitley was pronounced dead. The country music community was left in shock. Keith Whitley was only 34 years old. The next day, They lined Music Row in Nashville with black ribbons in remembrance. The death of Keith Whitley felt like the next chapter in country music's history, of some of its greatest stars passing on too early. From Hank Williams perishing in the back of his Cadillac on New Year's Day 1953, to Patsy Cline, Hawkshaw Hawkins, and Cowboy Copas dying in a plane crash in 1963, or any number of other high-profile deaths taking country stars during the height of their popularity. These events have allowed the timeline of country music to unfold like a tragedy, and have made folk heroes out of some of its greatest stars, including Keith Whitley. He had so much to live for at the time. His career was taking off. He had a young child. Whitley was considered country music's next superstar. He had just finished up his 4th studio album called I Wonder Do You Think of Me. He would die not knowing the Grand Ole Opry had a surprise invitation awaiting him just 2 weeks later. The cause of death for Keith Whitley was officially ruled alcohol poisoning by local medical examiner Charles Harlan on May 10th, a day after Whitley's death. The singer's blood alcohol level was reported to be 47, or almost 5 times the amount to be declared intoxicated in Tennessee. Police had found 23 empty cans of Budweiser at his house, an empty bottle of Scope, and 4 half-consumed bottles of hairspray. This was on top of the alcohol Keith was believed to have consumed the evening before. Amounts of cocaine and Valium were also found in his system. The death of Keith Whitley seemed like an open and shut case. It didn't take a stretch of the imagination to believe a country music singer had drank himself to death, especially Keith Whitley. Once, amid his sober streak in 1987, Whitley said in an interview, and I quote, "It was a matter of life and death. If I hadn't stopped drinking, I don't think I'd be alive today. I did so many crazy things while drinking into good." But in the aftermath of Keith Whitley's death, rumors swirled, the circumstances of which have continued to linger in popular lore to this day. As the Chicago Tribune and others reported at the time when his death was first discovered, there was a widespread rumor that it was suicide. A 47 alcohol level seemed exceptionally high, even for Keith Whitley. It's the equivalent of 21-ounce shots of 100-proof whiskey. Why would Keith Whitley drink himself to death when his career was just hitting its stride and he had so much to live for? One theory was that Whitley was conflicted, as a staunch traditionalist who was being asked to record more commercially viable material, or that he was feeling the pressure of stardom. Whitley recalled one time in 1986 hearing Miami, Miami on the radio station WSM in Nashville. He said at the time in a quote, "I was drinking and wondering what I was going to do, and they played that song and announced I'd been nominated for Best New Male Vocalist by the Academy of Country Music. I didn't even know it." Unquote. For sure, Whitley was struggling with stardom at the time to some extent, but that doesn't take into consideration the severity of Keith's drinking problem well before his country career took off in earnest. The publishing of Keith Whitley's autopsy report put most of the rumors to bed, though they would re-emerge in subsequent years. The medical examiner who wrote and performed the autopsy, Charles Harlan, would soon become widely discredited and blamed for numerous false reports and other unethical practices. He left the medical examiner's post in 1994 after 3 separate women accused him of sexual harassment. He was also known for making gruesome remarks to families and colleagues about deceased individuals and reportedly kept body parts and jars around his office and home. In 2005, the state of Tennessee found Charles Harlan guilty of 20 counts of misconduct and permanently revoked his medical license. Then in 2010, the accusations against Charles Harlan became even more severe, with the doctor being blamed for numerous botched autopsies, resulting in false murder convictions, including a man convicted for stabbing and murdering his cousin when the deceased died after having a seizure and falling on a glass table. 2 children Charles Harlan had determined had died of SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome, were later discovered to have been murdered by their parents. Charles Harlan had also been given false testimony in trials for many years. Some fans of Keith Whitley and conspiracy theorists have used the discredited legacy of Charles Harlan to wonder just how accurate the autopsy of Keith Whitley was, and if another cause of death could be possible. There have also been lingering questions about just how old Keith Whitley was when he passed. Though popular knowledge in much of the reporting on Keith Whitley's death said that he was 33 years old at the time and was born in 1955, this information supplied by his label, RCA Records, and printed in many reports and history books turns out to be false. According to his birth certificate and other documents, Keith Whitley was actually born on July 1, 1954, making him 34 years old at the time. Another wrinkle to the story of Keith Whitley's death were the revelations Lorrie Morgan made in her book Forever Yours Faithfully, published in 1997. In the book, Morgan goes into some fairly lurid details of Keith Whitley's life and death, including accusations of infidelity and how she couldn't even trust Whitley around alcohol-based toiletries or beauty products due to his addiction, even having to tie his leg to hers at night so he wouldn't sneak out of bed to drink, and how she would have to sometimes accompany him when he used the bathroom to make sure he wouldn't guzzle something on the counter or beneath the sink. Remember, Keith Whitley was thought to have consumed an entire bottle of mouthwash and numerous bottles of hairspray for their alcohol content on the day of his death. This speaks to the depths of Keith Whitley's addiction. Lorrie Morgan also called into question some of the specifics of how Keith Whitley was discovered on the day he died. She alleges that Whitley's manager at the time, Jack McFadden, dropped by in between when brother-in-law Lane Palmer made us 2 visits, but McFadden was unable to get Keith to answer the locked bedroom door, hearing rustling sounds inside. Jack McFadden didn't show any grave concern and ultimately left the house. Lorrie Morgan also alleges that Lane Palmer found a baggie of cocaine on Whitley's dresser when he discovered Keith on the bed, incapacitated, and swallowed it before authorities arrived. These revelations brought up questions if something more couldn't have been done to save Keith Whitley, or something could have been done sooner, while also supplying fuel to the idea that there was some sort of cover-up surrounding Whitley's death. Lorrie Morgan also alluded to shadowy characters in Keith Whitley's life, possibly drug dealers and others that may have wanted to do Keith Whitley harm for one reason or another. All of this information only helped to fuel conspiracy theories about the circumstances surrounding Whitley's passing. However, Lorrie Morgan and the Whitley family have never publicly disputed the finding that alcohol poisoning was ultimately responsible for Keith Whitley's death. The conspiracy theories at the moment remain just that, conspiracies. On May 12, 1989, more than 500 mourners attended Keith Whitley's funeral, where longtime friend and fellow Kentuckian Ricky Skaggs presented the eulogy and spoke specifically about the ills of drug and alcohol abuse. Keith Whitley was laid to rest at the Spring Hill Cemetery near Nashville, a serene final resting place that would later become a pilgrimage site for fans of country music. His gravestone bears 2 poignant quotes, "Forever yours, faithfully," and "His being was my reason," both of which are heartfelt tributes from Lorrie Morgan, his wife and fellow country music star. These inscriptions not only signify their deep bond but also stand as enduring symbols of Morgan's love and devotion to Whitley, even after his untimely death. Lorrie Morgan's career, which had been intertwined with Whitley's life and music, took a significant turn after his passing. Free from the burden of caring for her troubled husband, she found the space to fully dedicate herself to her music. In 1990, she achieved her first #1 hit with the song 5 Minutes, a milestone that marked the beginning of a new chapter in her career. The success of 5 Minutes was followed by a series of top 10 hits in subsequent years, solidifying her place in the country music world. Morgan's personal life also evolved after Whitley's death. She went on to marry fellow country singer and songwriter John Randall, and later she married another country artist, Sammy Kershaw. Both of these marriages, however, were short-lived. In between, she dated several prominent figures, including actor and United States Senator Fred Thompson, as well as Dallas Cowboys quarterback Troy Aikman. Despite these relationships, Morgan has always remained fiercely loyal to Keith Whitley's memory, often speaking of him with great reverence. She continues to be one of the most vocal advocates for preserving his legacy, ensuring that his contributions to country music are not forgotten. The couple's son, Jesse Keith Whitley, has also followed in his father's footsteps, carving out his own career in country music. Jesse Keith has embraced his father's legacy, both as an inspiration and as a responsibility, striving to honor the memory of a man who left an indelible mark on the genre. Keith Whitley's death not only had a profound impact on his family, but also on the broader country music community. One of the most poignant tributes came from Vince Gill, a rising country star at the time of Whitley's passing. Gill was moved to write the song "Go Rest High on That Mountain" in the wake of Whitley's death. a song that has since become one of the most iconic eulogy ballads in country music. The song, with its deeply spiritual and reflective lyrics, resonates with listeners who have experienced loss, making it a staple at funerals, particularly those of country music stars. One of the most notable performances of this song was at the funeral of George Jones in 2013, where Jill's emotional delivery, alongside harmonies from Patty Loveless, left a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. Ricky Skaggs, a longtime friend and collaborator of Vince Gill, provided harmony vocals on the original studio recording of Go Rest High on That Mountain. Skaggs and Gill had shared a history dating back to the late 1970s, when they were both members of the bluegrass band Boone Creek. Their musical connection added another layer of emotional depth to the song, making it a fitting tribute to a fallen comrade in the world of country music. Keith Whitley's legacy is not just defined by his accomplishments before his untimely death, it's also shaped by the sense of unfulfilled potential that many in the industry feel he left behind. Despite his relatively short career, Whitley managed to achieve 2 number-1 hits and 4 top 15 singles. His music resonated deeply with fans, and there is little doubt that he would have continued to dominate the country charts had he lived. His voice, his style, and his songwriting were all set to play a significant role in the evolving landscape of country music. Many believe that Whitley's influence extended beyond his own music, shaping the direction of the genre as a whole. Country music historians and industry insiders often speculate that the commercial resurgence of country music in the late 1980s and early 1990s, often referred to as the Class of '89, which included artists like Garth Brooks, Alan Jackson, Clint Black, and Travis Tritt, might have been different had Whitley been alive to contribute. His absence was keenly felt, as it seemed like a piece of that era was missing without him. Garth Brooks, one of the most successful country artists of all time, has been vocal about his admiration for Keith Whitley. When Brooks was announced as an inductee into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2012, he reportedly tried to decline the honor, feeling that Keith Whitley, along with Randy Travis, should be inducted before him. Brooks said, "My generation's shot at Haggard and Jones was Keith Whitley. Keith needs to be in here." This statement underscores the profound respect that Brooks and many of his peers have for Whitley, not just as an artist, but as a cornerstone of the country music tradition. The enduring impact of Keith Whitley's life and music is felt not only in the songs he left behind, but also in the memories and tributes of those who knew and loved him. Lorrie Morgan, with her unwavering dedication, continues to honor his legacy, ensuring that his contributions to country music are remembered and celebrated. Their son, Jesse Keith Whitley, carries the torch forward, reminding the world of the talent and spirit of his father. As fans visit Spring Hill Cemetery, they not only pay their respects to Keith Whitley, but also reflect on the profound loss that his death represents, a loss that reverberates through the hearts of those who loved him and the country music community as a whole. The gravestone, with its touching inscriptions, serves as a reminder of a life cut too short, but also of the lasting legacy that Keith Whitley left behind, one that continues to inspire and move people to this day.